It's a real privilege and a pleasure to introduce my friend, Father Neil Xavier O'Donoghue, and I'll give you his brief biography as I introduce him. He's originally from Ballincollig, County Cork, in Ireland. As you can tell, you'll be able to tell he's from Ireland. He was formed for the priesthood in Redemptoris Mater Seminary in Kearney, New Jersey. In the year 2000, Neil was ordained to the priesthood for the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Newark. After ordination, he served in a local New Jersey parish for 2 years, and from 2002 to 2013 as prefect of studies at Redemptoris Mater Archdiocesan Missionary Seminary in Kearney. He studied at Seton Hall in South Orange, St. Vladimir's in New York, at Notre Dame in Indiana, and at St. Patrick's Pontifical University, Maynooth, and Redemptoris Mater Pontifical University in Callao, Peru. In 2013, he returned to Ireland on loan to the Archdiocese of Armagh, where he helped establish the new Redemptoris Mater Seminary located in Dundalk, County Louth. In 2018, he took up a new assignment as lecturer of systematic theology in Ballincollig Parish, County Cork. At St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth. Weekends, he often celebrates Mass in Ballincollig Parish, County Cork. He's the author of St. Patrick, His Confession and Other Works, 2009, the book that Cara just mentioned, The Eucharist in Pre-Norman Ireland, which came out from Notre Dame University Press. He's the editor of the third edition of Frederick Edward Warren, The Liturgy and Ritual of the Celtic Church, 2010. He's published articles appearing in various theological journals, magazines, and books. Since 2012, he's written a monthly column on the theology of the Holy Father in the Messenger of St. Anthony, and he is a regular contributor to the Pray Tell liturgical blog hosted by St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. He's currently serving as program director for liturgical programs at the Pontifical University and as acting director of the National Center for Liturgy. Since 2020, he's also served as the executive secretary for liturgy to the Irish Catholic Bishops' Conference. I might add a personal note, the Societas Liturgica, a major international ecumenical organization, held its last meeting 2 years ago at Maynooth in Ireland, and I'm not sure we could have been able to bring it off without Neil's on-the-spot help to organize our meeting. So I'm grateful, as are many, to him. His presentation is entitled, Did Early Christian Ireland Have a Unique Celtic Liturgical Rite? Father O'Donoghue.
Okay, very good. So thanks for coming out to listen to this obscure topic this afternoon. And hopefully it won't be too painful. But anyway, I suppose what I'm looking at is this early Irish liturgy. It's an area that interests me greatly. And I suppose I did my PhD on the subject a number of years ago. And there are just a couple of things that have been kind of going around in my brain since then, and so it's just kind of coalescing into this paper that I'm giving here today. So hopefully it'll make sense, and hopefully it'll be of some interest to people. So I suppose the idea of a Celtic rite is not accepted by any mainstream liturgical scholar today. That no proper textbook of liturgy, no history of Christian liturgy will have a section on a Celtic rite. However, the concept is alive and well. And I think one of the main reasons that it's alive and well is that if you Google Celtic Rite, I'm not talking to any students here because I know the students never go to Google to find their answers, but if some person were to Google Celtic Rite, the first entry will give you a very beautiful Celtic Rite entry on Wikipedia, which again, I know the students of Boston College don't go near, but sometimes in Ireland I've got some students who kind of maybe tend towards that source. But anyway, so this article gives the impression of being a serious and academic exposition of the so-called Rite, and it's based on a wide array of early medieval liturgical manuscripts. However, it's composed around the nucleus of Henry Jenner's article on the Celtic Rite, which appears in the 1913 edition of the Catholic Encyclopedia. So this Catholic Encyclopedia kind of went off copyright, and it's quite well written, the Catholic Encyclopedia in general, but most of his articles then found their way to be the nucleus of the Wikipedia articles on Catholic stuff, and the Celtic Rite is one of these. I suppose what's different is that the Catholic Encyclopedia was conceived of as a particularly English-speaking Catholic perspective on theology, on life in general. And this article was written by Henry Jenner, 1848 to 1934, who was a High Church Anglican and the son of an Anglican curate who had been nominated as the Bishop of Dunedin in New Zealand. So Jenner had spent his life dedicated to the revival of the Cornish language and to promote Cornish identity and even Cornish nationhood. So Cornwall in England, that he's the founding father of the Cornish nation, or this idea of making Cornwall into a nation. He composed their national anthem, and it's interesting that he was commissioned to write an entry in a Catholic encyclopedia because he actually had a very, very conflicted relationship himself with the Catholic Church throughout his life. His wife converted to Catholicism, and then it was kind of very, very, very unusual. And he was working in the British Museum, but he doesn't actually have any training in liturgy, and yet he was the one to write this. And because he is a fan of all things Celtic, that Celtic was his goal in all things, and he was highly involved in trying to make Celtic identity become stronger, it's hardly surprising that he manages to gather all the evidence together to find a so-called Celtic Rite that is, according to him, markedly different from any other Western liturgical rite. The other main source for this Celtic Rite is a work by the Reverend Frederick Edward Warren. 1881, he wrote a book called The Liturgy and the Ritual of the Celtic Church. So again, Warren was a fellow of St. John's College, Oxford, and he was undoubtedly an excellent scholar. And his book is still obligatory reading for anybody working in the field of early Irish liturgy. In fact, as we just heard, that I edited the third edition of that book. I edited a reprint not that long ago for Gorgeous Press in New Jersey. Just giving a shout out to it. You can find the whole thing online on Google Books if you want to see the whole PDF. But the one I did, they actually sent it to Hong Kong or something to have the old text kind of clarified. So it's actually easier to read the one I did. But just to say, I don't receive any loyalties for it, but it's there. But anyway, Warren produced this book that is a very good book. Yet Warren was a creature of his time. And as of all of us, he brought his own preoccupations to his academic work. It is important to note that he was a priest of the Church of England in the years after the Oxford movement. This movement within the Anglican Communion, among other things, helped Anglicans to rediscover the liturgical heritage of Western Christendom. But while particular elements of the liturgical and patristic heritage were rediscovered and reappropriated by wider elements of the Anglican Communion, the movement also was a cause of no little upheaval for the Communion in general. When a good number of the more prominent members of the Oxford movement formally entered communion with the Roman Catholic Church, this caused consternation in both church and society in Britain. In particular, the retirement of Newman spelled disaster for the Oxford movement and contributed to the end of this movement per se and the evolving of the current Anglo-Catholic wing of the Anglican Communion. So this is the context in which we need to consider Warren's Liturgy and Ritual. While it is probably his most lasting academic contribution that is still in print today, Warren did not produce it simply because he thought the texts that it contained were interesting in and of themselves. Warren produced a number of other editions of earlier liturgical texts of different types of liturgy. There were a couple of other ones of Irish material, the Corpus Missal and the Antiphonary of Bangor, but then he had another few liturgical books that he produced that were not related to Ireland. And he was not a specialist in Irish literature, Irish history, or Celtic liturgy. But the unifying factor in all of his efforts was that all of the liturgical editions he produced would support the Church of England as a separate and independent Catholic Church. And in all of his work, he was concerned to show that the Catholicity of the Church of England could exist independently of the papacy. In particular, he was interested in early Irish liturgy because he believed that the Celtic Church was important because it offered the Church of England her own heritage independent of Rome. So the issue that Warren was struggling with was there another way to be Christian other than Catholicism or Protestantism, this via media that Newman and the Tractarians had proposed? In other words, was there another way to be a Christian apart from the Church of Rome? In liturgical terms, so in other words, that you have all of these high church Anglicans that their most famous members have become Catholic, so they're looking for a justification not to become Catholic. And the way they can find this is to say we have a genuine liturgy in Britain that is not Roman. But the problem is that when you go to the actual history, that the earliest English liturgy is Roman, pure Roman liturgy, because England is basically evangelized by St. Austin, St. Augustine of Canterbury, is sent by the Pope. Gregory the Great sends Austin to England to evangelize. So the early church in England is heavily Roman. And even, the books went with Augustine from Rome to England. So the liturgical sources are very Roman. And so that they're looking for a non-Roman priesthood of liturgical practice, and they can't find anything in the English church. So the English church doesn't have any liturgical material that's non-Roman. So they need to find something to justify their existence. So they'll go and they'll look at the pre-Augustinian Christians who dwelt on the island of Britain. So in other words, Britain was there, and then when the Angles and the Saxons came in and invaded, they formed what is now England. And these British Christians got pushed aside and became what's, I suppose, today Welsh, Cornwall, Brittany, and that these. So their idea is that these people would have had, and definitely the church was present in Britain prior to the invention of England. Again, sorry, I'm a bit biased, but prior to them inventing England, there was already Christianity in Britain. So how did these British Christians celebrate? What liturgy did they have? And unfortunately, there is no liturgical manuscripts that survive from pre-English Britain. So their solution, the solution that Warren comes up with, is Warren says that if we look to Ireland, we can have an idea of how early British liturgy looked like. Because St. Patrick, the most famous of these British Christians, evangelized Ireland, and his mission, which is traditionally dated to 433 to 93, predates the Augustinian mission to Canterbury by about 150 years. So, in other words, if we look to Ireland, the theory is we can find out how they were celebrating in Britain. So Warren proposed a Celtic rite that was specific to Ireland and other Celtic regions. But while this rite had its basis more in geographic ties to areas identified as being Celtic, or even more problematically, merely imagined geographical ties to Celtic places. So for Warren, the Celtic Church is the church which existed in Great Britain and Ireland with certain continental offshoots before the mission of St. Augustine, and to a varying extent after that event, until by absorption or submission, the various parts of it were at different dates incorporated into the Church of the Anglo-Saxons. Therefore, the Celtic Rite was a liturgy that was celebrated in these areas. He synthesizes all of this, and the overarching concern is to prove that this liturgy was not Roman. And he shows great bias, really, against anything Roman. He says there can be no Roman liturgical influence in these areas whatsoever. So, for example, when he deals with music, he readily admits that he doesn't know anything about how the music was like in early Ireland, liturgical music. He has no idea. And, but he says that the only thing that he can say with certainty about it is that it's not Roman, although he knows nothing about it. So he just says, it cannot be Roman because that goes against my theory. So again, it's actually very interesting today that they've done a lot of work in that area, and they've managed to reconstruct some of the liturgical music from early Ireland. But that's post-Warren. So the thing, though, is that while scholars of the liturgy in early Ireland, we might lament the lack of the material available to us, in fact, a great deal of material survives from early Ireland than many other regions of Europe at the time. And it's, and that Warren has done a very good job of gathering this material together. But the difficulty is that then he has classified this material as being somehow or other different to everything else. And so this idea that you have a Celtic church in early Ireland that becomes synonymous with the early Christian or the pre-Norman period. So this is in a sense, the Anglican idea. So then this concept of the Celtic church that was basically, I'm saying, invented by these high church Anglicans to justify a liturgical pedigree, then also is received very well in Ireland like a generation later. So a generation later in Ireland, where you are beginning to have movements, where you have a Celtic revival, and that you have this idea of a nationalistic looking for an Irish identity. So this Celtic church finds fertile ground in Ireland during this. So if the Anglicans benefited from the theory of liturgical precedence of a Celtic church, the Irish nationalists were looking for something to prove that Ireland was distinct from England. And it's interesting to note how Owen MacNeill, 1867 to 1945, was an important Irish nationalist politician and an educated man, a university lecturer, and the first Minister for Education of the Irish Free State. And he used the concept of a Celtic church in an awful lot in his academic career to advance the cause of Irish nationalism. So while these scholars were predominantly Roman Catholic and not at all interested in the Anglican identity, they were interested in the idea that Ireland is somehow or other different. And so even to our own day, this kind of concept has survived, that early Ireland was kind of like a Dark Age hippie colony inhabited by gentle gurus doing their own Christian thing, far removed from the stultifying influence of sub-Roman bishops and their dioceses. Indeed, the idea that the Irish had a different type of church was very popular up until quite recently. The dominant theory was that the monastic element of the church in Ireland overshadowed the episcopal, and that the abbots took the place of the bishops, so that the bishops were relegated almost to the position of chaplains to these abbots, with the function of ordaining monks as priests at the abbots' suggestions. But today, most historians of early Christian Ireland would disagree with any assertion that an independent Celtic church ever existed, given that there are very major problems with this very concept, as the supposed church, as the Celtic Rite is extremely unclear and rooted more in place than in time. In this vein, most popular works will juxtapose Julius Caesar's De Bello Gallico with medieval Irish hagiography and Alexander Carmichael's late 19th century collections of Scottish folklore, thus producing a vision of Christianity more at home on the shelves of the New Age section of a trendy bookstore than in the pages of a history book. Indeed, it seems that everyone is tempted to find in the Celtic Church the ideal form of Christianity and a model for how the Church should change today. All of this is to say that I consider the idea of a particularly Irish rite as existing in the early medieval Irish period as being historically untrue. And also, more importantly, as a liturgical historian, I consider that it has muddied the waters when we're considering early Irish liturgical history. Over the last century or more, a multitude of experts in history, archaeology, and related fields have studied a wide variety of Irish churches and manuscripts, church plate, the famous chalices and patens and these things, saints' lives, law. But these specialists in pre-Norman Irish studies seem to be almost afraid to consider what went on in these ancient churches. So there's a ton of literature out there. There's all sorts of interesting books and articles on how the churches were built, what was the lives of the saints, the tithes, the so many different things that are there. But these scholars, who are from the new Irish universities mainly, are kind of afraid to venture into what actually happened in these church buildings. And so there's a tendency to think that the liturgy was somehow like, but not quite the same as could be found in churches throughout Western Europe. So really, the main work that I've tried to do in my work is to see what was the liturgy like in early Ireland, and what can we say about it. So in this, I suppose to say, most liturgical scholars seem to assume that everybody knows what a liturgical rite is. So in other words, most liturgical books, history books will talk about liturgical rite, but it's very rare to see a definition of it. So it's hard to find any modern definitions of what a rite is. So I'll use the definition of the great Robert Taft. He uses the definition of a liturgical rite as a coherent, unified corpus of liturgical usages followed by all the churches within a single ecclesiastical conscription. So it's this unified corpus of liturgical uses followed by all the churches within a single ecclesiastical conscription. So, and in this, I would propose that the Irish Church perhaps is the best local example of the Gallican Rite. So in the early Middle Ages, the Gallican Rite was the most spread of the liturgical rites in Western Europe. Besides Ireland, it's present-day France, Germany, the Low Countries, all celebrated the liturgy using a form of the Gallican Rite. The Gallican Rite was also closely related to the northern Italian liturgical traditions, and it even seems that the Hispanic or Mozarabic rites in the Iberia probably descended from a common ancestor to the Gallican Rite. The other main Western rite is the Roman Rite, which in its origin seems to have been a fusion of North African and Roman liturgical traditions. So if you look at the older histories of liturgy, they'll speak about how the Roman Rite gradually displaced the Gallican Rite. Charlemagne is often credited with the abolition of the Gallican Rite and the forced imposition of the Roman Rite in his domains. However, I think today we can see that Charlemagne's liturgical efforts are actually less radical in terms, and we can see that there's much more continuity in the liturgical traditions. So complete liturgical standardization in any given region remained impossible until the invention of the printing press. But I would see Western liturgical history as, in the early and high Middle Ages, as being a history of the homogenization of the Roman Rite with the various Gallican traditions. The Roman canon was the central prayer of the Mass and was universally adopted and gave a Roman imprint to the whole liturgy, but virtually all the other elements, from chant melodies to feast days, to the texts of various prayers, prefaces, and other liturgical traditions, were equally likely to be of Gallican or Roman origin. And while Ireland is not as individual in her liturgical practices as once thought, nevertheless, early Irish liturgy is an important part of the European whole. In my opinion, the most important indication of the integration of the early Irish in the debate is the origin of the Bobbio Missal. So the Bobbio Missal is a missal that some authors 100 years ago would say is Celtic. Today, it's the typical Gallican book. So today's scholars said the Bobbio Missal is the best example we have of a Gallican missal. And it's no more Irish than the Man in the Moon. It was once upon a time in the library of the monastery of Bobbio that had been founded centuries previous by St. Columbanus, and therefore, because they were looking for material to form a Celtic rite, they hooked this book in to make that rite, even though, in fact, it is the most typical Gallican book that we have. So the other problem is, the other thing is at the end of the period, of the pre-Norman period, that we have a group of missals that are in Ireland, and these are the Corpus, the Roslin, and the Drummond missals. And the truth of the matter is, we don't know whether they're pre-Norman or post-Norman, because this homogenization process is going on, and basically the idea is it's got some nice, I don't know, hope I'm not going to insult any art historians, it's got some nice Celtic squiggles in the pictures. And because it's got like that Celtic artwork and some of these, they think it must be Celtic. It must be Celtic Rite. But when you look at the text, it's much more common to what you would have found in England or what you would have found in the Gallican area that's becoming Roman. And to the point that we don't even know, we can't even say for definite, is it before or after the Norman invasion of Ireland? So I suppose if we'd asked the early Irish themselves what rite they were celebrating, they would undoubtedly have been confused by the question. However, the 8th century life of St. Bridget is a particular contemporary source that can give us an insight to their understanding of the rite that they were celebrating. Although it is written about 200 years after the death of St. Bridget in 525, so it's 8th century, so it's about 250 years later, we can assume that the opinions on liturgy would be fairly typical for its 8th century composition date. So this Vita Prima tells us that on one of her journeys, an angel warned St. Bridget at night to evacuate the building as was about to burn down. So St. Bridget gets a vision from an angel saying, the building's going to burn down, you better evacuate. So she gets all her nuns out, and then the nuns begin to ask her, and they ask her, do the angels normally talk to you? And Bridget says, yes, that there's an angel normally at her side, and among other things that the angel does, she says, it's thanks to him, I can hear the masses of holy men, which they celebrate to the Lord in distant lands as if they were close by. And she tells us that this angel's visions of holy men saying masses in distant places allowed her to change the practice of the Mass in the cathedral in Kildare, in her cathedral. Her cathedral church in Kildare. She was able to introduce Roman practices, so she tells us, according to the Vita Prima, I heard masses in Rome at the tombs of St. Peter and Paul, and it is my earnest wish that the order of this Mass and of the universal rule be brought to me. Then St. Bridget sent experts to Rome, and from there they brought the Masses and the rule. Again, after some time, she said to these experts, after they come back, she said, I discern certain things have been changed in the Mass of Rome. Since you have returned from there, go back again. And they went back and brought it back as they found it. So whether or not Bridget sent envoys to Rome, we don't have any historical proof one way or the other. But what is true is that in their mind, they were celebrating the Mass as the Bishop of Rome was celebrating. Also, I think what is quite interesting is they didn't seem to be perturbed, at least in the least, by the fact that the Mass in Rome had changed. So this changing of the Mass in Rome didn't bother them. They just sent the guys. The angel revealed to Bridget that the Mass had changed, so she sends back the guys to Rome, and they come back with the updated version. Big deal. But this is how they might have seen things at that time. So as to how I would see how Mass might have been celebrated in early Ireland, I'd look at the work, especially of this French scholar, Matthew Smith. Smith is, I think his grandfather is Irish, so he's got a good handle on things. So Smith's reconstruction of the Gallican Mass suggests that the actual celebration lasted about between 1 and 2 hours, a typical Sunday liturgy. And it would probably have been shaped like 3 scriptural readings, Old Testament, Epistle, and Gospel, chants and prayers, including a psalm, the Benedictus, the Canticle of Zechariah, maybe the Gloria, the Trisagion, maybe the Kyrie, different songs, sometimes a diaconal litany, a homily, dismissal of catechumens and penitents, Then the Eucharistic Synaxis, which would have been composed of about 10 variable prayers, including a prefatio, 2 prayers of intercession, diptychs, nomina, prayer of the Pax, Eucharistic prayer, then the Sanctus, the post-Sanctus prayer, institution narrative, then the Our Father, a lengthy episcopal blessing of those who would receive communion, and then 2 post-communion prayers. So I think this would have been fairly typical of all the churches that we study in Ireland. And although remember that one of the reasons that the Gallican Rite didn't survive was that it didn't have any one centre around which it could coalesce. So if we can agree that the Eucharistic liturgy in pre-Norman Ireland and the other Celtic areas would have been more typically Gallican, then future study can only benefit from integrating the formerly identified Celtic material with the already identified Gallican sources, which should lead to a better picture of Western liturgy in general. With this new integration into the greater Western liturgical experience, we can better understand the gradual passage from the regional variations of the liturgical practice in the Gallican area to a gradual merging of virtually all Western liturgy into the mongrel rite that is the Roman Rite. A case in point is the gradual adoption of the Roman canon as the preeminent Eucharistic prayer of the medieval Roman Rite. So, again, if the Roman canon is the mark of Roman liturgy, it's quite interesting because one of the classic, Don Bott's classic, 1935 study of the canon, his oldest sources is what he calls the Irish family. So if the Celtic Rite is not Roman, how come the oldest example we have of the most Roman prayer are coming from the so-called Celtic Rite books? So it's the Stowe Missal is the Stowe Missal and the Bobbio Missal. This book that I'm saying is actually far more Gallican and isn't Irish at all, but the Stowe Missal are the 2 oldest extant. The prayer isn't Irish, obviously the Roman canon is not coming from Ireland, but the oldest example of it could well be. So, and this is just to say that I'm not saying with this the Irish Church didn't have any liturgical peculiarities. All places did. And that certain things were given more prominence. So it seems that the rite of the Fractio Panis, or the breaking of the bread, was more important in early Ireland. There's many aspects of medieval Eucharistic theology that seem to have very early examples in Ireland, like the tendency to celebrate a multiplicity of masses, and this idea of having as many masses as possible celebrated for a particular intention seems to have been there. The emphasis on the Eucharist as sacrifice, it finds a good home early in Ireland. And the other thing is there's a very interesting tradition in Ireland of the Eucharistic chrismal. So the chrismal was what you would carry the chrism in, but there's a lot of texts of early Irish monks and churchmen carrying the Eucharist on their person in a chrismal, in what was the vessel for chrism, is now kind of like a pyx today that would be carried by the priest, but not carried today. If a priest is carrying the pyx or somebody's carrying a pyx with the Blessed Sacrament in it, you're bringing it somewhere. You're bringing it to somebody that's sick. You're bringing it on a sick call. You're going to the hospital with it or something. But the early Irish monks seemed to just have it for like a relic, nearly. That they had it. If somebody happened to be dying, it was really cool. They had the Eucharist on them. They could give it to them, but that was not the reason that they were carrying it on their person. That they had it as a relic, and it's kind of like one of the earlier examples of this Eucharistic devotion before you had tabernacles and that. And I think it's very much at the root of a lot of the later Western Eucharistic devotion. So I suppose the other thing that I'd wonder at this stage is always my question is, so what? So did Ireland have a rite? Did Ireland not have a rite? I mean, how does this help us today? Does this, I'm sure specialists might be interested in this one way or the other. We can have an argument about it. I'm sure there might be people here that have got very different opinions that will point out everything that I've said that's wrong. But so what is always the problem. So does it matter whether Ireland had a liturgical rite or not? So I think that it is important. Again, from a scholarly point of view, I think it is very important because this will allow us to get a better handle on early medieval liturgy. This way we can have a better idea of what's happening in Europe by, it would be a fair, I'm not quite sure, but it's like 15-20% of the early European sources are so-called Celtic Rite. So if we integrate this into the other European material, it gives us a much better idea of what's happening in Europe in general. So I think that just gives us a much better liturgical history. The other thing I'd say is that, what does this mean for us today? So I'm looking particularly at Ireland, where practice of Christianity is in free fall, particularly among the younger generations, that the church is facing a serious existential crisis. And what can we do with this early Christian material? Is it that if we resurrect a Celtic rite, or like some people do, resurrect something that never happened, will this be the solution to all the problems? And I don't think so. I mean, I think that there's much that we can learn from early Irish Christianity. And I know for myself, my own spiritual life, it's been very important to be in all these sources to see how Christianity was celebrated in the early Irish church, the heritage of and the enculturated gospel that was there, even without a Celtic rite, I think is a national treasure that we need to recapture the essence without the idea to recreate something that, as I said, never existed. So we need to have a healthy reappropriation of elements of Christianity that are rooted in the local practices, the beauty of nature, and the all-embracing presence of God, who protects us in the midst of life's challenges. And this is vital if Christianity is not to be relegated to the museums and the history books. So I don't think we can just outsource this discussion because to the secular faculties, shall we say? Because, as I say, if you look 100 years ago, most of the people working in this area were either Catholic priests or Anglican ministers were working in this area. In the last 50 years, an awful lot of work is being done by, I suppose you could say, the NUIs in Ireland, these national universities that are secular and are producing great scholarship, great work. But I think from a Catholic, from a church point of view, we can't say, okay, we had our turn, now it's your turn, good luck with it. But I think there has to be something there has to be a relationship with this to be found again. One example that I think that has been done, I think rather well, is that the Irish Church recently, as in 2007, produced its own national proper. So there's a selection of prayers for the Irish saints that were produced and approved by the Vatican and everything, newly composed, because the missal that we use in Roman Catholic worship is in Latin, the Editio Typica, and then it's given to the nation to make it their own. So the Irish bishops did a very good job in composing or finding earlier prayers for all of the Irish saints, like St. Patrick, St. Kevin, St. Bridget, St. Columcille, all of these saints, that they have many of these prayers, St. Malachy of Armagh, St. Lawrence O'Toole, all these saints, they have managed to do a beautiful set of propers for this time period. The other thing is, again, this is not quite, that we're beginning to look at the possibilities of working on the Liturgy of the Hours, maybe in union with other churches in Ireland, not as an exclusively Catholic program, to see, is it possible, the shared heritage, to celebrate these saints together, at least in the Liturgy of the Hours, in a common way. And so these sorts of references to early Ireland, that there has been an awful lot of work done on trying to find the examples of early Irish liturgical art, the manuscript art, all of these as ways to connect with people today. In Maynooth, where I'm normally lecturing, we have a very beautiful handwritten gospel book that was produced not that long ago, that the Cardinal O'Fee Gospel Book. So the Cardinal O'Fee was one of the Archbishops of Armagh that died suddenly. And his friends, because he was a great lover of all things historical, all things Irish, his friends got together and they hired a scribe. There's actually somebody that still does the old Irish style writing. And he, on vellum, wrote a gospel book that's in use in the college in Maynooth, for the high masses of the year, the important masses. We use this handwritten gospel book in the early Irish style. So these are the kind of things that I think that can be there. These bridges to the past, I think, is for me the best way forward to see how can we reconnect with our heritage, looking towards the holiness, as opposed to looking for some fake Celtic rite. Try to find something that is genuine. And I suppose just as I'm coming to the end, if allow me just maybe to finish on the note of Seamus Heaney, which is one of Ireland's most important poets, who himself did not have a perfect relationship with the church, but appreciated so much of what the church and the Irish Christian heritage had to offer. So he one of his poems that I really like is this one. It's St. Kevin and the Blackbird. And then there was St. Kevin and the blackbird. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out inside his cell. But the cell is narrow, so one turned up palm is out the window, stiff as a crossbeam, when a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tucked, neat head and claws, and finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and reign for weeks until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. And since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, imagine being Kevin. Which is he, self-forgetful or in agony all the time? From the neck on, out, down through his hurting forearms. Are his fingers sleeping? Does he still feel his knees? Or has the shut-eyed blank of under-earth crept up through him? Is there distance in his head, alone and mirrored, clear in love's deep river, to labour and not seek reward, he prays? A prayer his body makes entirely, for he has forgotten self, forgotten bird, and on the river bank, forgotten the river's name.
Thank you for the lecture. I'm ignorant of this topic to a large degree, so bear with my question. You know that Gallican rite that you talked about, was that in Latin?
Yes, everything was in Latin at this
Just
stage.
like I knew when I was a boy.
Yes.
So my next question is, in those rites, right, you know how after Vatican II there's a reform to allow rubrics, vestments, songs, liturgical dance back in from the communities? Was there any vestiges in that, in any of that research, like as far as, was there any prayers in Gaelic? Were there any like liturgical dance, different vestments? Was there a prayer in Gaelic? Anything like
there
that?
Was, okay, I don't think there was any dance. There was, the prayers were all in Latin. However, we have some prayers, private prayers in Irish, and a lot of things like a different type of prayer that was there. Like, for example, the breastplate of St. Patrick. If you look it up, again, we have Christ be beside me, guys. But the whole thing, it's a long prayer, and so you have that, and then we have a lot of notes that would have helped priests to preach about the liturgy, and things like the fraxio, the breaking of the bread, was very important for them. That everything would have had a symbol that we have. For example, the Dernaflan paten is about this size. It's a much bigger plate than you'd find even in a church today. And there we find that they break the bread and they kind of say, well, this is to symbolize the prophets, this is to symbolize the bishops. So they have different kind of meanings to it. So there were definitely like local interpretations given, but it was not, I mean, to be honest, for somebody today, they would not really be able to tell the difference between what was happening in Rome and what was happening in Ireland, what was happening in France. It would all be this kind of Latin that you couldn't understand. But thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Father Neil, for a fascinating presentation. Just you mentioned the Stowe Missal, and as one of the earliest witnesses of the Roman canon, was there any difference in the early Irish usage of the Roman canon? Is it largely what we would recognize today, or were there more Irish saints?
There were more Irish saints. There was a ton of Irish saints in it. This is another thing that was in Ireland, that we have the martyrologies are typical in the West, but the Irish really loved their martyrology. So there would have been a lot of extra saints in the Roman canon. The bits that sometimes even today the priest is allowed to eliminate all the saints. But in Ireland it was not a case of eliminating them, it was a case of adding to them. So the Stone Missal will have many more. And the thing about the Stone Missal is there are two hands of the Stone Missal. So the Stone Missal was written and then revised. And one of the revisions is it adds yet more saints to it. So, but it is, as I say, for the textual history of the Roman canon, it's one of the most important early sources.
Hi, Father. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I should preface my question by saying that I'm from Kildare, the home of St. Bridget. So I grew up with Bridget Well, about 2 miles down the road, and a deep devotion to Bridget. And I also grew up with an old tradition that, in fact, she held the rank of bishop. And this was because apparently she would enter last in the liturgical procession when it would come in, that Bridget, or the abbess of Kildare, was the last to enter, which would kind of signify a status above and beyond the ordained and that were gone ahead of her. So I just wonder if that's to be true, or did we just make it up in Kildare?
Well, I wouldn't claim that Kildare people made anything up, but Bridget, we have 3 medieval lives. We have there's one in Old Irish and there's 2 in Latin. The 2 in Latin have just been republished by, is it Freeman? Philip Freeman, with Four Courts Press in Dublin, has just republished Latin English edition of the two Latin lives, the Vita Prima and Coadjutus. I can never get his name right. So you can take a look at those. That would be good. And then there's the Bahu Brigidu that was also published many years ago, but it's available in English as well in translation. And these, none of them claim that Bridget was a bishop. She ruled the church in Kildare. It was very unusual. It was a double monastery. It was a double foundation. So it had men and women that would have come together in the church from separate buildings. They would have come together into the cathedral church of what is now the Church of Ireland Cathedral in Kildare. I know that, I think it's the Vita Prima, that it's one of the Latin ones anyway, says that Patrick gave Bridget a bishop as her driver. So her chariot was driven by a bishop. So Patrick thought that this was a good function for a bishop, to be the chauffeur for St. Bridget. And as he was there anyway, he could say Mass when she needed Mass said, and when any of her monks from the male foundation needed to be ordained, he could ordain them. So in a sense, I would say this to say maybe Bridget had the authority of a bishop, but sacramentally was not a bishop because she had the driver to do that stuff.
Other questions or comments? All right, well, thank you, Father Neil, for a wonderful discussion. Let's give him a round of applause.